Hello everyone, today we will step into the dying embers of an empire, an age where war elephants thundered down ancient roads, where betrayal crept behind silk curtains, and where one emperor watched centuries of glory collapse in smoke. Picture it, the sky over Delhi burns orange, not from the setting sun, but from cannon fire and shattered domes. Ash drifts like black snow, curling through once sacred halls. Inside the Red Fort, an old man wrapped in royal silk stares at the city his ancestors ruled for 300 years, now crawling with death. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done, standing in his sandals, with an empire crumbling beneath your feet? The year was 1857. The air over Delhi trembled with smoke and rebellion. Bahadur Shah Zafar, last of the Mughals, had been a reluctant figurehead in what would come to be known as the Sipri Mutiny, or, for some, the First War of Indian Independence. But in these final days, there was little left to rule. Streets once humming with poets and traders now ran silent, save for the occasional echo of British boots and gunfire. He sat in the hall of private audience, beneath the inlaid ceiling where his ancestors had once held court in golden splendor. The mosaic tiles were dulled with soot now. And the emperor, no longer the mighty Padishah of Hindustan, but a frail man in his 80s, was surrounded not by nobles, but by silence. Outside the fort walls, Delhi itself had become a battlefield. British troops, backed by brutal efficiency and unrelenting siege engines, had clawed their way into the city inch by inch. The Yamuna River, once the lifeblood of the imperial gardens, now reflected only blood and smoke. The Mughal army, never fully cohesive, had splintered. Many of its commanders were gone, dead, captured, or vanished into the wind. Those that remained were desperate, cornered men with nothing left to lose. Yet still, some embers glowed. In a corner of the Red Fort, a small group of loyalists made a last stand. Among them were elephant keepers, mahouts who had served generations of emperors. These war beasts, armored and enormous, had stood idle for months. Now, their massive bodies trembled with tension. The time would come, they believed, when the elephants would ride again. But inside Bahadur Shah's heart, the war had already taken its toll. He wandered through the Diwan-i-Khas, its marbles still cool beneath his sandals. Here, beneath Persian calligraphy that once proclaimed, "If there is paradise on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here," he found no peace. The paradise was gone. The voice of his ancestors, Babur, Akbar, Shah Jahan, were silent now. At times, the emperor still received visitors. A few loyal poets and Sufi mystics came to speak of fate, to read verses by flickering oil lamps. One night, a blind court musician played the sitar in the dark, fingers trembling, plucking a raga so mournful it made the candle weep wax. Zafar listened with closed eyes. Perhaps he was dreaming of another Delhi, one filled with peacocks and ghazals, not corpses and gunfire. His sons, meanwhile, still moved about the palace grounds, clinging to fantasies of resistance. They plotted from behind sandstone screens, whispering of counterattacks, of rallying the scattered sepoys. One of them, Mirza Mughal, declared he would lead a fresh charge from the Lahore gate at dawn. But the emperor said nothing. He had stopped dreaming of victory. Outside, the British had breached Kashmiri Gate and pressed inward with brutal force. Their Sikh allies cleared alleyways with bayonets. There was no sanctuary left. The imperial bazaars had become mass graves, the Jama Masjid stood empty under a clouded sky, and each night brought the sound of distant drums, getting closer. Within the walls of the Red Fort, the scent of jasmine still clung to a few corners, but even the gardens were wilting. Zafar stood alone by a Jiroka, one of the palace balconies that overlooked the river. Below, the waters shimmered darkly. He thought of Humayun's tomb, where he had once gone to pray. Would his bones ever rest there? Or would the British scatter his body to the wind like they had scattered his empire? He pressed one hand against the carved stone rail. It was warm, not with sunlight, but with the heat of fire. The British were burning the outer quarters. He could hear the screams now. Inside the stables, the war elephants stamped their feet. Something was coming. Something final. Something no emperor could stop. The corridors of the Red Fort were no longer safe. With each passing hour, the empire's foundation cracked further, not from the cannonballs that shattered its walls, but from the quiet betrayals within. Bahadur Shah Zafar, once surrounded by scholars, dancers, and the sons of nobility, now found himself ringed by men whose loyalty faltered like candlelight in a storm. Some whispered that he was a coward, a ghost of kings past, not fit to wear the turban of Hindustan. Others watched him with a calculating eye, not as an emperor, but as a liability. The British had not yet taken the inner sanctum of the fort, but they didn't need to, not when treachery was already doing their work for them. In a forgotten corner of the palace, Mirza Mughal convened a secret council. The eldest of Zafar's sons, his face carved with sleepless nights and desperation, he was determined to wrest control from his aging father. Around him gathered a strange mix: disillusioned sepoy officers, minor nobles, and one or two palace guards who had quietly switched allegiances. They spoke in hushed tones, too cautious for open defiance, yet bold enough to plan. "The old man will do nothing," one of them hissed. "He sits and recites poetry while the city bleeds." "He must abdicate," said another. "Put the command in younger hands." But there were no younger hands strong enough to hold it. The empire was already ash in the wind. Still, they plotted, not to save the dynasty, but to carve something of their own from its ruins. Servants, too, had begun to vanish. Some fled into the city. Others stayed, but only to spy. One cook was caught passing messages wrapped inside chapatis. A eunuch, once trusted in the harem, was discovered mapping the fort's interior for the enemy. Even the elephant mahouts, who had always held a sacred trust, spoke in riddles. Some wanted to use the beasts in one final battle. Others whispered of surrender. Bahadur Shah knew. He had always known. But he said nothing. Instead, he continued his slow walks through the palace halls, sometimes stopping at the portrait galleries. The paintings of his forefathers watched him with silent judgment. Aurangzeb's scowl. Akbar's calm eyes. Babur's proud stance with a falcon on his wrist. And then, in the corner, his own likeness, painted when he was young, dark-eyed and full of promise. He looked away. One night, in the dark hours before dawn, a messenger came. A British column was advancing through the Chandni Chowk. Resistance had all but collapsed. The Pathan soldiers guarding the fort's Lahori gate were dead or fled. The British had offered terms, surrender, and perhaps the Red Fort would be spared. Refuse, and the entire complex would be razed. Mirza Mughal begged his father for a response. "We still have the elephants," he said. "If we strike now, one swift blow, they'll break." Zafar shook his head slowly. "They do not break. They bury." But Mirza would not listen. Neither would his brothers. As the sun rose red over a blackened city, the princes prepared for a charge unlike any seen in Delhi in centuries. In the elephant stables, chains were unfastened. The beasts stirred, sensing the change in the air. Their tusks were fitted with steel caps. Their armor, some of it centuries old, was strapped to their thick hides. Eyes like molten coals blinked slowly as the mahouts mounted them one by one. These were not parade elephants. These were war-born titans, descended from beasts that had charged into Afghan lines, trampled Rajput cavalry, and stood like stone walls against cannon fire. Mirza Mughal led the line. Behind him, 8 elephants, each with twin riders and crimson banners flapping from their backs, waited for the signal. The British would not expect this, not now, not from an empire in collapse. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed they might succeed. The gates burst open with a groan like the cry of the earth itself. The elephants charged. Dust rose. Men screamed. Streets shook. But war had changed. The British did not fight with sabers and honor. They fought with rifle drills, shrapnel shells, and cold calculation. As the elephants barreled down Chandni Chowk, British artillery repositioned with practiced precision. The first volley rang out before the beasts had cleared the market square. A shell struck the lead elephant's flank. It shrieked, a sound like metal tearing through flesh, and reared up. Mirza Mughal was thrown, trampled beneath the very creature he had hoped would lead him to glory. The other elephants crashed onward. One overturned a cannon. Another slammed through a wall. But each was met with fire. Muskets flared from rooftops. Grenades exploded underfoot. The beasts panicked, turned on one another, or fled down alleyways, crushing friend and foe alike. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah heard the distant chaos. He did not flinch. The rebellion had consumed itself. Not in honor, but in desperation. And now, it would turn its teeth inward. The morning after the failed elephant charge was eerily quiet. The sound of hooves and cannon had faded, replaced by the buzz of flies and the moans of the dying. Chandni Chowk, once the vibrant heart of Delhi, lay shattered beneath broken arches and crumbling facades. The elephants, what remained of them, wandered wounded and confused, some tangled in harness, others lying still, their great bodies too vast to bury. Among the blood and rubble, the corpse of Mirza Mughal was found, twisted and crushed, face barely recognizable, sword still clutched in a broken hand. His brother, Mirza Khizr Sultan, had vanished in the chaos. Another, Mirza Abu Bakr, had fled toward Humayun's tomb, hoping to regroup, but the rebellion was no longer a rebellion. It was a rout. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah did not ask about the battle. He had heard all he needed in the distance, the deafening roar of elephants, followed by the thunder of artillery, and then silence. He stood in the mirror hall, alone, watching as a spider spun its web across the once golden ceiling. By noon, the British were at the gates. And this time, there would be no final charge. Zafar's servants had either disappeared or turned. His guards had stripped off their uniforms and fled. The last to remain was a trembling attendant who had served him tea for 30 years. The man wept openly as he brought the emperor his final cup. "They are here," he said. Zafar nodded. "Then I must leave." He did not flee to battle, nor to the tombs of his ancestors. Instead, he slipped quietly through a side passage, one of the many hidden corridors built into the Red Fort's ancient bones, and emerged in the gardens that once bloomed with marigold and night jasmine. Now they were dry, their fountains choked with ash. There was no ceremony, no royal entourage. The Emperor of Hindustan, once master of a realm stretching from the Himalayas to the Deccan, walked alone. He passed through the palace gates, exited into the city he no longer ruled, and vanished into the chaos like a shadow. For days, no one knew where he had gone. The British stormed the fort, finding only empty rooms and abandoned weapons. They ransacked the private quarters, looted priceless artifacts, tore down silks, and trampled centuries of memory into dust. One officer, writing to his superiors, described the scene as a dead hive of luxury, long since rotten beneath its golden shell. But the emperor was not dead. Not yet. Hidden by loyalists, Zafar made his way across a city in ruin. He passed through mosques turned to barracks, through alleys thick with corpses, through temples and tombs that no longer offered sanctuary. His robes, once embroidered with silver thread, were now smudged with soot and blood. Eventually, he reached the one place he believed they would not defile, Humayun's tomb. The great mausoleum stood like a silent sentinel above the ashes of Delhi. Its red sandstone and white marble facade had seen centuries pass, had watched empires rise and fall. Here, Zafar thought, perhaps he could wait, for death, for mercy, or for history to forget him. But history does not forget. word of his hiding place spread quickly. It began with whispers, first among local villagers, then among soldiers who remembered his face. A reward was offered: capture the emperor, and be honored. It wasn't long before British soldiers arrived at the tomb. Zufar was found sitting beneath the central dome, reciting verses from the Quran. When they approached, he did not resist. He merely raised his eyes to the arches above and said, "This place once housed kings. Now it will house shame." The soldiers took him into custody without struggle. And yet, the fall was not finished. The British did not seek just a victory, they sought a spectacle. The next day, they brought Zufar's sons, those still alive, into the open square before the tomb. Without trial or ceremony, they were executed. Their blood stained the ancient steps. Their severed heads, still dripping, were brought to the old man in a cloth sack. When Zufar opened it, he said nothing. He only closed his eyes. The war elephants were gone now, either dead, sold, or wandering aimlessly through the jungles beyond the city. Their riders were corpses. The palace was ashes. The dynasty was over. And Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal emperor, was now a prisoner. He was taken not in chains, but in silence, riding in a humble bullock cart under heavy guard. The streets he passed through no longer bowed to him. Children threw stones. Women spat curses. The empire he once ruled had not merely fallen, it had devoured itself. Behind him, Delhi smoldered. Before him, nothing waited. Only trial, exile, and oblivion. The journey southward was slow and humiliating. Gone were the palanquins, the guards in crimson turbans, the poetry recitals under perfumed canopies. Bahadur Shah Zufar, once the sovereign of Hindustan, now rode in a creaking wooden cart, flanked by British sepoys who barely acknowledged his presence. The road from Delhi to the British garrison at the Red Ridge wound through scorched fields and war-ruined villages. At every stop, curious onlookers gathered, murmuring in disbelief. "That is him?" they whispered. "The emperor?" It seemed impossible. The figure in the cart was not a ruler but a frail, sunken-eyed old man wrapped in faded muslin, his beard stained with dust, his lips cracked by silence. He did not speak, not even when offered water or when the soldiers barked commands. He stared ahead, at nothing, at everything. Perhaps at ghosts. At the garrison, he was briefly held, questioned, and displayed. British officers, some curious, some contemptuous, took turns observing him, as if he were a relic from a lost world. They asked him about the rebellion, about his role, about the deaths. But Zufar offered them only poetry. "You may crush the flower," he told one young officer, "but the scent remains in the soil." The British didn't want his poetry. They wanted a scapegoat. Soon after, he was transferred under heavy escort to a riverboat bound for Rangoon. His trial would take place not in Delhi, not in the land of his ancestors, but in exile, far from the marble tombs and saffron sunsets of the Mughal world. The choice was deliberate, to erase not just the man, but his memory. On board, he was confined to a small cabin. The air was thick with river heat and mildew. The windows were barred. The guards were indifferent. Sometimes, he could hear the faint cries of birds overhead, or see flashes of lightning in the clouds. But mostly, there was only the sound of water lapping against wood, and the ache of remembering. He thought of the Hall of Mirrors, of Mirza Mogul's boyish pride, of the elephants dressed for war, of his wife, Zinat Mahal, and her trembling hand as they had said goodbye, of Delhi, burned, betrayed, butchered. The trial in Rangoon was swift and carefully orchestrated. The British presented him as the symbolic head of a violent uprising, the instigator of rebellion, and the cause of death for their countrymen. Witnesses were summoned. Letters were cited. His seal was shown, affixed to proclamations calling for the slaughter of infidels. Zufar, in his defense, spoke softly. He admitted little. He blamed much on the Sepoys. He described his role as ceremonial, a puppet dragged into war. But no one was listening for truth. They were listening for finality. The verdict was never in doubt. He was sentenced not to death, for the British feared making him a martyr, but to lifelong exile in Burma. A slow erasure. A quiet death. His prison was a crumbling residence in Rangoon, damp and forgotten. The walls peeled. The roof leaked. Rats scuttled in the corners. And yet Zufar still carried himself with remnants of dignity. He wrote verses on scraps of cloth. He prayed 5 times a day. And each evening, he sat by the window and watched the sun melt into the river, murmuring couplets under his breath. People began to visit him, not many, but enough. Local poets, Indian sympathizers, a few curious Burmese scholars. To them, he was not a rebel. He was a ruin. A monument. A warning. Years passed. One by one, his companions died. His attendants aged. The British guards changed rotation, forgetting who he had once been. Eventually, Zufar became a shadow in his own home, a figure seated in silence, wrapped in wool during the monsoons, trembling in the tropical heat. He had no throne. No country. No name that meant anything anymore. He was not emperor. He was not prisoner. He was a ghost. And still, the elephants came, in his dreams. In those quiet final days, he would sometimes wake with a jolt, his fingers clawing the air, heart racing with remembered hoofs. He could see them again, those towers of flesh and iron, their trunks swinging like pendulums of doom, their eyes burning with fury. He could hear the drums, the horns, the scream of cannon and man alike. And always they were charging. And always they were falling. One night, a storm broke over Rangoon. Lightning flashed like war across the sky. The guards found him the next morning, seated in his chair, eyes closed, body cold. Bahadur Shah Zufar had died as he lived in his final years, quietly, overlooked, fading. He was buried in a simple grave, unmarked at first. No marble. No dome. No verses carved into stone. Only the earth, and the memory of footsteps. And somewhere in the wind, perhaps, the faint echo of elephants. Years passed. The red fort, though battered, still stood, its walls scorched, its halls empty, its throne abandoned. Delhi had changed. The British had tightened their grip, laying new railways, draining the spirit from the city like marrow from bone. The Mughal Empire was officially declared over. Not defeated in battle, but erased, scrubbed from the annals of power and confined to history books written by those who never wore the dust of India on their skin. Yet in quiet corners of the subcontinent, the memory of Bahadur Shah Zufar smoldered like incense at the base of a forgotten shrine. His poetry survived, passed in secret from hand to hand, scrawled into notebooks by candlelight. His verses, soaked in sorrow and exile, found ears among those who still wept for the fallen glory of Hindustan. Na jishi ki aankh ka nor hoon, na jishi ka dil ka kara hoon. I am neither the light of anyone's eye, nor the comfort of anyone's heart. He had written that in Rangoon. In a prison with no iron bars, only walls of memory and loss. A few years after his death, someone placed a small stone over his grave. Nothing grand, just a line scratched into it. The British had not allowed a full inscription. They feared what a name might stir. But the people remembered. Eventually a headstone was allowed, modest, carved in Urdu. Bahadur Shah Zufar, the last Mughal emperor of India, exiled to Rangoon, died in 1862. But no mention of the empire. No mention of Delhi. No mention of the elephants. The war beasts themselves had vanished from history as swiftly as their master. Most were killed during the chaos or sold to traders far from the capital. One was said to have fled into the forests near the Ganges and survived for years, wandering with a torn banner still tied to its tusk. Another was spotted decades later in Nepal, blind and gray, with the faint remains of battle armor fused to its skin. None of them were ever used in battle again. The age of elephants was over. So was the age of empires. The British now ruled with bureaucracy and rifles, not war drums and royal decrees. They renamed roads, rebuilt palaces into offices, and constructed statues of their own generals where Mughal fountains once flowed. They recast the past as myth and framed rebellion as criminality. Bahadur Shah was labeled a puppet, a failed poet, a powerless relic. But in the alleys of Old Delhi, beneath torn awnings and behind shuttered tea stalls, his name was still whispered. A grandmother reciting his verses to lull a child to sleep. A blind musician playing an old tune on a battered sitar. A young revolutionary, years later, drawing strength from the memory of an old man who walked to exile with a straight back and silent defiance. Sometimes, history is not written by the victors. Sometimes, it is whispered by survivors. Bahadur Shah Zafar did not die with a sword in hand, but he died carrying the full weight of a broken world. Not every ending is loud. Some are slow dissolves, empires rotting not in fire, but in silence. And if you walk today through Rangoon, now Yangon, and visit the modest graves shaded by low trees, you'll find flowers laid there still. Not by tourists. Not by rulers. But by people who remember what it meant when a throne turned to dust. And if the wind is just right, you might even hear it, a deep, distant rumble. Not thunder. Not trains. But the ghostly echo of elephants. Still charging. Still falling. Still remembered.